U.S. copper tariffs send shockwaves through the EV industry. Prices soar, supply chains freeze. Reuters, July 31st, 2025. Trump's 50% copper tariff sets off panic on Wall Street. Electric car production stalls overnight. The Guardian, August 1st, 2025. It wasn't a war, a virus, or even a labor strike. It was a single policy decision, inked in Washington and detonated across North America's most critical industries, from halted EV factories in Michigan to construction sites in Vancouver grinding to a standstill. Copper, an unsung hero of modern infrastructure, had suddenly become too expensive to touch. As prices spiked and tempers flared, one question echoed across the continent. When you weaponize a metal, who really pays the price? Copper has long been the quiet backbone of North America's modern economy. Buried inside every electric vehicle, wind turbine, charging station, and power grid upgrade, it's the invisible lifeline of the green transition and a symbol of economic interdependence between the US and Canada. For decades, this relationship was stable. The US sourced over 60% of its semi-finished copper imports from North American partners, especially Canada and Mexico. Canadian manufacturers, in turn, benefited from proximity, free trade frameworks like USMCA, and the sheer scale of US demand. The border between the two nations wasn't a wall. It was a copper vein. This cross-border harmony fueled explosive growth in key sectors. EV production lines in Michigan, battery plants in Ontario, and transmission infrastructure projects from Alberta to Arizona all depended on reliable copper flows. Analysts called it the quiet alloy of continental cooperation. But by early 2025, cracks began to show. Amid intensifying rhetoric about economic nationalism, the Trump administration initiated a Section 232 investigation into copper imports, citing national security concerns. Canadian suppliers were alarmed, not just by the investigation itself, but by the administration's opaque messaging. Was this truly about defense, or was it about votes? Then came the tariffs. On July 30th, Trump announced a sweeping 50% tariff on all semi-finished copper products, effective August 1st. While refined copper cathodes remained exempt, the bulk of copper goods, pipes, wires, cables, suddenly became dramatically more expensive to import. The shock was immediate. Markets panicked, then corrected, but damage was done. The golden age of easy cross-border copper was over, replaced by a new reality of red tape, price surges, and finger-pointing. For North America's tightly wound copper economy, the fuse had been lit. The copper tariff didn't emerge from a vacuum. It was crafted in the crucible of a resurgent economic nationalism. On February 25, 2025, the Trump administration quietly launched a Section 232 investigation into the national security implications of copper imports. Section 232, a provision of the Trade Expansion Act of 1962, allows the president to impose trade barriers on materials deemed vital to national defense. It was the same legal foundation used to justify steel and aluminum tariffs in Trump's first term. This time, copper was the target. The rationale? U.S. officials cited over-reliance on foreign suppliers, strategic vulnerabilities in the green transition, and the weaponization of global metals markets by hostile powers. But critics quickly pointed out a glaring issue. Over 40% of America's semi-finished copper came from Canada and Mexico, hardly enemies. Nonetheless, by July 9th, Trump's office confirmed plans for a 50% tariff on semi-finished copper products, with a 3-week grace period before implementation on August 1st. The White House messaging was theatrical. At a rally in Pennsylvania, Trump declared, "We're building American EVs with American copper for American jobs." Supporters cheered, but industry leaders winced. The fine print revealed contradictions. While semi-finished products like wires and pipes were taxed, raw copper, like cathodes, remained untouched. Analysts speculated this was due to domestic shortfalls. U.S. refined copper output stood at 1.1 million metric tons in 2024, well below its 1.6 million ton demand. America simply didn't have the mining or refining capacity to go fully autarkic. Nonetheless, the signal was clear. Imports were politically toxic even if practically essential. The market reacted fast. On July 31st, copper futures on the COMEX exchange spiked 13% to $5.69 per pound. But by August 2nd, as traders realized key cathode imports were exempt, prices dropped over 20%. This whiplash sowed chaos in procurement offices nationwide. Electric vehicle, EV, manufacturers were among the hardest hit. Ford announced a price hike across its EV lineup. Stellantis suspended 2 battery supply deals. Tesla, which had already warned of thin copper margins, reportedly paused production on several models due to supply volatility. Analysts estimated that copper costs alone added $500 to $6,000 per EV, depending on the model. And it didn't stop with cars. Homebuilders faced copper cost spikes of 20 to 30%, adding $17,000 to $22,000 to average housing construction costs, according to CoreLogic and the National Association of Home Builders. New builds slowed, margins shrank, consumer confidence slipped. In Texas, Illinois, and Florida, utility companies submitted rate hike proposals, citing soaring copper prices in new grid transmission projects. Each mile of high-capacity line required roughly 5 tons of copper, and now every ton came with a surcharge. By mid-August, the tariff had created a paradox. Trump's stated goal was to protect U.S. industry. Yet manufacturers, utilities, and construction firms, many based in red states, found themselves under siege from the very policy meant to shield them. Still, in public, the administration stood firm. In private, lobbyists scrambled to carve out exemptions, and Wall Street began pricing in a long winter for clean energy. Canada didn't see it coming, not entirely. Though Canadian officials were wary after the Section 232 probe was announced, many believed that long-standing trade ties, USMCA provisions, and North American energy goals would shield them. They were wrong. Within 48 hours of Trump's July 30th announcement, Canadian copper exporters were fielding frantic calls from U.S. buyers. Orders were paused, contracts renegotiated. In British Columbia, home to a major cluster of copper processors, one supplier reported losing $11 million in contracts overnight. The Canadian federal government convened emergency meetings with copper producers and EV partners. By August 5th, Minister of Trade François-Philippe Champagne issued a statement calling the tariffs unjustified and deeply harmful to North American competitiveness. But Canada stopped short of retaliation. Instead, it deployed a strategic response, leveraging diplomacy, shifting alliances, and quietly redirecting supply chains. Ottawa opened fast-track negotiations with the European Union and South Korea to redirect its copper exports. It also accelerated domestic investments in EV manufacturing, aiming to decouple final product exports from U.S. copper restrictions. One surprising twist: Mark Carney, the former governor of the Bank of Canada and ex-Bank of England chief, now a senior climate advisor to the Trudeau government, publicly rebuked Trump's tariff strategy. In a widely shared interview, Carney stated, "You cannot build a green North America on a foundation of copper nationalism." His comment was echoed across Canadian media and business circles. Editorials blasted the U.S. for self-sabotage, while Canadian utilities began sourcing materials from Chile and Peru, nations with which Canada has stable trade ties and FTAs. The copper tariff also reignited conversations around Canadian self-sufficiency. A plan to expand copper smelting capacity in Ontario was revived. Provincial governments explored subsidies for recycling and secondary copper production, and automakers like Stellantis and Hyundai doubled down on their Ontario-based EV operations, pivoting toward export markets outside the U.S. What looked like economic pain morphed into an economic pivot, yet tensions remained. U.S. EV producers reliant on Canadian copper began lobbying for exemptions. Canadian firms, caught mid-supply contract, demanded Ottawa launch a WTO challenge. Diplomats worked overtime to keep the friction from becoming fracture. Carney's stance signaled more than critique. It was a line in the sand. The message was subtle but firm. If the US chose isolation, Canada would choose innovation. By September 2025, the copper war hadn't escalated, but it hadn't resolved either. On paper, trade continued. No borders were closed, no supply chains were severed. But in practice, North America's economic engine had seized. Electric vehicle manufacturers couldn't predict their margins. Utilities paused grid upgrades. Home builders delayed launches. Canadian copper suppliers diversified markets, but faced friction in transitioning logistics. U.S. companies begged for clarity, but none came. The real casualty? Coordination. North America's green transition was designed as a continental project, leveraging Canadian minerals, Mexican labor, and American innovation. But with tariffs in place and no exemptions offered, the region's synergy was fractured. Politically, both sides were trapped. Trump couldn't walk back the tariffs without undermining his base. Canada couldn't concede without appearing weak or complicit. So, the continent stood still. All the while, China, Chile, and the EU watched and capitalized. Copper shipments were rerouted. Investment shifted. EV partnerships, once destined for Detroit, now pointed toward Dusseldorf or Daegu. The race toward a clean energy future hadn't stopped. It had just left North America behind. The Canadian cost: disruption in the heart of Ontario's EV boom. In Windsor, Ontario, just across the river from Detroit, a once celebrated EV corridor is now in limbo. The city, home to a sprawling Stellantis LG battery plant and dozens of copper component suppliers, was positioned to be Canada's answer to Silicon Valley for electric mobility until August 1st, 2025. That's when the Trump administration's 50% copper tariff officially kicked in, catching Ontario's copper processors in a vice. Canadian firms like Glencore and Superior Copper Tubing, both heavily integrated into U.S. EV supply chains, were hit hardest. The cost of fulfilling semi-finished orders for American partners spiked instantly, with no warning, no exemptions, and no relief in sight. "We lost 40% of our outbound volume to the U.S. in 1 week," said an executive at a mid-sized wire manufacturer speaking anonymously. "We had contracts, we had trucks on the road, and suddenly those trucks turned around." Stellantis, which had planned to scale up its Windsor facility to meet U.S. demand, paused new hiring. Its U.S. partners hesitated to finalize orders, citing material cost unpredictability. The economic ripple ran deep. Ontario suppliers had to lay off workers, delay purchases of raw cathode material, and shift focus toward Europe and South Korea. Ottawa responded with subsidies and reallocation plans. But adapting to new export destinations takes time and cost. According to internal estimates from Canada's Ministry of Trade, the tariff disruption cost the regional economy over $900 million in lost exports and capital delays within just the first 60 days. Windsor streets are still humming, but the mood has changed. What was once optimism now feels like guarded patience. In coffee shops and boardrooms, a single question dominates. If being a good neighbor can't protect you from economic whiplash, what will? The American blowback, when copper costs more than control. In Phoenix, Arizona, heat waves aren't the only thing climbing this summer. Utility bills are too, and copper may be to blame. Salt River Project, one of Arizona's largest public power utilities, recently submitted a proposal to raise electricity rates by 11%, citing increased input costs from grid upgrades. One key cost driver: copper wiring. Each mile of new transmission line now costs thousands more due to tariff-affected supply contracts. "We're not political," one SRP official told the Arizona Republic. "But when you raise copper prices overnight, we have to pass those costs somewhere." It's a domino effect felt well beyond utilities. Across the U.S., the construction industry is stalling. Home builders in Florida and Texas report delays as copper pipe costs rise 30%. A report from the National Association of Home Builders showed new single-family home prices increased by $18,000 on average between August and October 2025, driven largely by copper-related material surcharges. Then there's the car market. In Detroit, Ford executives were forced to adjust their EV pricing model just weeks after launching a mid-market electric SUV. Copper component costs had added roughly $1,200 per vehicle, forcing sticker prices up and triggering customer backlash. Consumers noticed. Dealerships reported a 12% drop in EV inquiries by mid-September. Combined with ongoing inflation fatigue, many potential buyers postponed purchases, undermining the Biden-era EV tax credit momentum. Worse, small manufacturers, especially in the Midwest, were caught between unsustainable supplier costs and non-negotiable client contracts. For many, margins vanished. In the name of strategic independence, America had imposed a cost no one expected: instability. And as Canadian firms quietly redirected shipments to Europe and Asia, U.S. manufacturers were left asking a painful question: was sovereignty worth the surcharge? North America now stands at an inflection point. The copper tariff, born of political calculus, has fractured an ecosystem built over decades, one that powered EVs, homes, and hopes for a green future. Canada, once the continent's most reliable copper partner, is recalibrating. The US, determined to assert industrial independence, is absorbing shockwaves it may not be ready for. Neither side is retreating, yet neither can move forward alone. What was once a seamless supply chain is now a geopolitical tug-of-war, where EVs are stalled, costs are rising, and competitors overseas are gaining ground. This isn't just about trade, it's about trust, coordination, and whether a continent that once thrived on collaboration can survive a future built on isolation. In the race to shape the future, will North America win together or lose alone trying to go it solo? Are you American or Canadian? Share your story and your perspective in the comments below.